Darkness presses in around you, the air thick with damp stone and the faint metallic scent of chains. Somewhere above, a single torch flickers, casting long shadows across the cold dungeon floor. You're trapped, with only hours left before dawn brings your execution. But this isn't just any prison, and you're not just any prisoner. You're a knight, a rogue, a hero of legend, and your story is about to take a turn so daring it will be told for centuries. Welcome to the heart-pounding world of medieval escapes and rescues, where every second counts and only the boldest survive. These aren't just stories, they're masterclasses in courage and cunning. Imagine outsmarting guards with nothing but a smuggled spoon, or scaling castle walls under cover of moonlight. Picture a loyal band of rebels staging a midnight raid to free their captured leader, or a disguised princess slipping through enemy lines with a dagger hidden in her sleeve. These legends gripped the medieval imagination for a reason. They pushed the limits of what seemed possible, turning ordinary people into symbols of hope and defiance. And today, we're diving deep into 26 of the most breathtaking escapes and rescues ever recorded, tales that will make you question what you'd do in their place. What makes these stories so unforgettable? It's more than just the thrill of the chase. Each escape, each rescue, reveals something profound about the medieval world. The unbreakable bonds of brotherhood, the lengths people would go to protect their honor, and the sheer ingenuity required to outwit impossible odds. From Robin Hood's audacious prison breaks to lesser-known but equally astonishing feats of daring, these legends are a testament to the human spirit's refusal to surrender. So ready your nerves and steady your pulse, because by the end of this journey, you'll never look at a locked door or a high wall the same way again. Richard the Lionheart's escape reads like something straight out of a bard's tale, except every pulse-pounding moment really happened. After returning from the Third Crusade, the legendary king found himself imprisoned by Duke Leopold of Austria, who saw a golden opportunity to ransom Europe's most famous warrior. Locked away in the castle of Duenstein, high above the Danube River, Richard faced a grim fate: endless captivity unless England paid a staggering sum. But this was a man who'd fought Saladin's armies in the scorching deserts of the Holy Land. He wasn't about to wait for rescue. What happened next was a masterclass in medieval cunning. Richard's first move, charm. He spent months winning over his guards with tales of battle and even shared meals with them, all while quietly studying their routines. Then came the disguise, no fancy illusions, just simple deception. Legend says he dressed as a humble kitchen worker or a merchant, maybe even a pilgrim, blending into the daily traffic of servants coming and going. But the real stroke of genius, timing his escape during the chaotic Christmas festivities when the castle was bustling with distractions. Under cover of revelry and winter darkness, he simply walked out, slipping past drowsy guards too preoccupied with feasting to notice one more shadow in the night. The aftermath was pure drama. Richard's captors scrambled to find him, but by then he was already miles away, hidden by loyal allies who smuggled him through hostile lands. It took weeks of dangerous travel, avoiding patrols, moving only at night before he finally reached safety. And here's the twist: his escape wasn't just a personal victory. It became a symbol. For centuries after, storytellers embellished it with theatrical flourishes, secret tunnels, coded messages, even a troubadour minstrel helping him flee. But the core truth remains. Richard's audacity showed the medieval world that no prison was unbreakable and no captor invincible if you had wit enough to outthink them. This wasn't just a king saving himself. It was a blueprint. Future escape artists, from rebellious nobles to wronged knights, would study Richard's playbook. Because in an era where power was held by walls and chains, his greatest weapon wasn't his sword, it was his mind. And that's what makes this story the perfect opening to our list. It proves that even in the darkest dungeon, the right plan, and the nerve to see it through, could turn the impossible into legend. The legend of Robin Hood isn't just about stealing from the rich, it's about outsmarting them when it matters most. And no moment captures that better than the daring rescue of Little John from the clutches of Nottingham's infamous sheriff. Picture this, the sheriff's dungeon, a place of iron bars and cruel whispers, where the air reeks of damp straw and despair. Little John, Robin's most loyal companion, sits chained, awaiting a brutal punishment meant to lure the outlaw into a trap. But Robin Hood was never one to walk blindly into danger. He danced around it, turning the sheriff's own arrogance against him. This wasn't just a fight of strength, it was a battle of wits. Robin knew storming the castle gates would be suicide, so he crafted a plan so audacious it bordered on madness. Disguise was his first weapon, slipping into Nottingham as a humble potter, a traveling monk, or even a drunken beggar. Legends vary, but the brilliance stays the same. He didn't just hide in plain sight, he used it to his advantage. Guards dismissed him, the sheriff underestimated him, and by the time they realized their mistake, Robin was already inside the dungeon, picking locks or bribing jailers with a smuggled purse of silver. Then came the archery. Some versions say Robin fired a single arrow through an open window, severing the rope binding Little John's hands. Others claim he distracted the guards with a flurry of shots, creating chaos as his merry men swarmed the prison. But the most thrilling detail, the escape wasn't silent. Robin wanted the sheriff to know exactly who'd outplayed him. As they vanished into Sherwood Forest, stories say he left a mocking note, or even loosed one last arrow with a message tied to it, a taunt that would gnaw at the sheriff's pride for years. This rescue wasn't just about saving a friend, it was a statement. In an era where the powerful thought their dungeons were unbreakable, Robin Hood proved that no lock could hold back cleverness and courage. And that's why this tale echoes through history. It's not just an adventure, it's a blueprint for rebellion, showing how the underdog could strike back against injustice with nothing but a quick mind and a steady aim. The sheriff had walls and soldiers. Robin had something far stronger, the loyalty of his people, and the audacity to believe even the mightiest fortress could fall. William Wallace's name alone struck fear into the hearts of English soldiers, not just because of his skill in battle, but because no prison could hold him. Long before his final betrayal and execution, Wallace pulled off escapes so bold they became the stuff of Highland legend. Picture the scene, a dimly lit English garrison, the air thick with the scent of sweat and iron. Wallace, bruised but far from broken, sizes up his captors with the calm precision of a man who knows this isn't the end of his story. His most famous prison break wasn't about stealth or disguise. It was raw, calculated violence, a reminder that even chained, a cornered warrior is at his most dangerous. The English underestimated him. They saw a prisoner, not a storm waiting to be unleashed. Accounts suggest Wallace waited for the perfect moment, perhaps when guards changed shifts or when their attention wavered after a long night of drinking. Then, with the speed of a man who'd spent years surviving ambushes in the glens, he struck. Chains became weapons, fists turned into hammers, and before the guards could sound the alarm, Wallace was gone, vanishing into the misty folds of the Highlands like a ghost. But this wasn't just physical strength, it was strategy. He knew the land like the lines on his palm, every hidden gully and dear path leading to sympathetic crofters who'd hide him without question. What makes this escape legendary isn't just the act itself, it's what it represented. Every time Wallace slipped his captor's grasp, he proved English authority wasn't absolute. To the Scots watching, it was a spark in the dark. If one man could defy an empire, why couldn't they? And the English, they learned the hard way that capturing Wallace was only half the battle. Keeping him was impossible. Even after this escape, rumors swirled that he'd bribed a guard, that local villagers smuggled him out in a cart of hay, that he'd picked locks with a smuggled nail. The truth was simpler and far more terrifying. William Wallace didn't need tricks. He needed only an instant of opportunity and the unshakable will to seize it. This wasn't just a prison break, it was a declaration. In an era where the powerful believed chains and dungeons could crush rebellion, Wallace's escapes whispered a dangerous truth. No cage is unbreakable when the spirit inside refuses to be tamed. And that's why his story outlived him. Long after his death, Scots still toasted his name not just for the battles he won, but for the nights he turned captivity into another chapter of defiance. Because some men aren't just prisoners, they're storms in human form, and no lock ever forged can hold back the wind. The siege of Shay-Tau-Gailard wasn't just another clash of swords and shields. It was a masterclass in medieval audacity, where desperation and ingenuity collided in the dead of night. Picture the scene, an imposing English fortress perched high above the Seine, its walls seemingly unbreachable after months of failed assaults. But deep within those stone corridors, French knights languished in chains, their fate hanging by a thread. What happened next wasn't just a rescue, it was a moment of sheer tactical brilliance that redefined the limits of wartime cunning. The plan hinged on the one weakness even the mightiest castles couldn't eliminate: human necessity. Every fortress had latrines, and Shay-Tau-Gailard was no exception. While English sentries patrolled the battlements, a small band of French knights, clad in near darkness, spotted their opportunity: a narrow waist chute, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. To most, it would have been unthinkable. To these men, it was a lifeline. One by one, they climbed through filth and stagnant air, emerging inside the fortress like shadows materializing from the walls themselves. The stench was unbearable, the risk unimaginable, but freedom for their brothers-in-arms was worth every ounce of grit. Timing was everything. The knights moved under cover of a moonless night, synchronizing their infiltration with a feigned attack on the far side of the fortress to draw guards away. Once inside, they moved with lethal precision, disabling sentries, picking locks with stolen keys, and rallying the imprisoned French soldiers. Chaos erupted as the rescued men turned the fortress's own corridors into a battleground, fighting their way to the gates where allies waited. By dawn, the impossible had happened. Shay-Tau-Gailard, the crown jewel of English defense, had been breached not by catapults or battering rams, but by the unlikeliest of weaknesses. This rescue wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a psychological earthquake. For centuries, castles had symbolized invincibility, their thick walls designed to repel armies. Yet here, a handful of determined men proved that no fortress was impregnable if you had the nerve to exploit its most humiliating flaw. The story spread like wildfire, whispered in taverns and barracks across Europe, a reminder that even the grandest designs of power could crumble before creativity and resolve. And that's why this moment endures not just as a footnote in siege warfare, but as a testament to the unyielding spirit of those who refuse to accept defeat, no matter the odds. Hereward the Wake didn't just escape her, he vanished into thin air, leaving behind a legend so baffling it still sparks debate centuries later. Picture the scene: Norman soldiers tightening their siege around Ely Abbey, confident their quarry was cornered. The rebel leader, a thorn in William the Conqueror's side for years, had nowhere left to run, or so they thought. When the final assault came, Hereward was gone. No dramatic last stand, no corpse to parade through the streets. Just empty armor and whispers of a man who'd slipped through their fingers like mist over the fens. How did he do it? Theories abound. Some say he used secret tunnels dug by monks, winding beneath the abbey's foundations to emerge far beyond enemy lines. Others claim he disguised himself as a fisherman, blending into the daily traffic of boats along the marshes, a stroke of genius in a landscape he knew better than his own heartbeat. But the most tantalizing possibility, that he never left at all. Local legends insist he hid in plain sight, sheltered by sympathetic villagers who'd sooner die than betray him. After all, this was a man who turned guerrilla warfare into an art form, striking Norman supply lines before melting back into the wilderness. If anyone could vanish under an army's nose, it was Hereward. What makes this disappearance so extraordinary isn't just the mystery, it's the aftermath. Unlike other rebels whose fates were sealed by the executioner's axe, Hereward's story never got a bloody ending. Some chroniclers insisted he fled to Europe, resurfacing years later as a mercenary. Folktales swore he lived out his days in the fens, a spectral figure who'd appear to lost travelers before dissolving into the reeds. Even the Normans, masters of propaganda, couldn't spin his escape as a victory, because how do you claim to have crushed a rebellion when its leader simply stops being there? Hereward's legacy isn't just about evasion, it's about the power of a story left unfinished. In an era where conquerors wrote history, his vanishing act became a silent rebellion all its own, proof that even the mightiest king couldn't control every narrative. For the Anglo-Saxons who'd lost everything, Hereward's unresolved fate was a flicker of hope. If he could outwit the Normans, maybe their spirit could too. And that's why his legend endures, not as a tale of defeat, but as a whisper in the wind, one that says some men can't be caught, only remembered. The Knight of the Swan glided into legend like a phantom, his armor gleaming silver, his face hidden behind a helm forged in mystery. Towering above the besieged castle walls, a noblewoman gazed down from her prison, her fate sealed by a tyrant's whim. Then, without warning, he appeared not with an army, not with fanfare, but alone, his sword silent in its scabbard. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a riddle wrapped in steel, a moment where medieval ideals of honor and secrecy collided in one breathtaking act. What makes this tale so captivating isn't just the damsel's liberation, it's the knight's refusal to reveal himself. Unlike other heroes who basked in glory, this stranger operated in shadows. Some versions say he scaled the tower using a rope of woven reeds, others that he slipped through a forgotten postern gate left unguarded. But the truth was far more poetic. He didn't need brute force. The tyrant's guards, conditioned to expect violence, never suspected a lone figure cloaked in humility, moving with the quiet certainty of a man who knew destiny favored him. And when the lady was freed, as swiftly as he'd come, the knight vanished, leaving behind only a single swan's feather and 100 unanswered questions. The mystery of his identity became the story's heartbeat. Was he a disgraced lord seeking redemption, a prince testing his valor incognito? The legends disagree, but the theme is clear. In a world obsessed with lineage and heraldry, true heroism could flourish unnamed. This resonated deeply in medieval courts, where anonymous acts of courage were celebrated as pure virtue, untainted by the pursuit of fame. Troubadours sang of the Knight of the Swan, not because he sought praise, but because he embodied the paradox of chivalry, how a deed could shine brighter when the doer remained in shadow. Yet this rescue also carried a warning. The swan, a symbol of transformation and fleeting beauty, mirrored the knight's ephemeral presence. His refusal to stay and accept rewards hinted at a deeper truth. Some heroes exist only in the moment of need, their power lying in their absence as much as their actions. For the damsel, his disappearance wasn't abandonment, it was a gift. She wasn't bound by gratitude to a named savior. Instead, she inherited a legend she could reshape for her own purpose. And that's why this story endured. It wasn't just about a tower or a rescue. It was about the freedom found in anonymity and the enduring magic of a hero who chooses to remain a question mark in history's margins. Eustace the monk's greatest trick wasn't stealing gold or outrunning naval patrols. It was convincing the world he'd mastered the impossible. By the time his captors dragged him to the executioner's block, the infamous pirate had already spun his darkest hour into a stage. Chains, mere props, guards, an audience waiting to be dazzled. With a grin and a promise to reveal secrets of sorcery, he turned his own death sentence into the performance of a lifetime, then vanished mid-sentence, leaving behind only a swirling cloud of smoke and a dozen stunned faces. The genius of his escape lay in preparation. Eustace wasn't just a smuggler, he was a student of human nature. He knew superstition ran deeper than reason in the medieval mind, and he wielded that fear like a blade. Weeks before his scheduled execution, he'd planted whispers among the guards' tales of his supposed apprenticeship to Moorish alchemists, of invisibility cloaks and fire that didn't burn. By the day of his escape, even the jailers half believed him. So when he demonstrated a mystical powder, likely common sulfur or ground charcoal smuggled in his sleeve, their hesitation gave him the split second he needed. The smoke bomb was theater, but the real magic was his understanding of how easily men see what they expect to see. Legends disagree on what happened next. Some say he dove into the fog-shrouded marshes of Flanders, where not even bloodhounds could track him. Others insist he boarded a waiting ship disguised as a friar, his trademark bald head hidden beneath a hood. But the most enduring version, that he never left at all, that he walked freely through the gates in the chaos, perhaps as one of the very soldiers sent to hunt him. Because Eustace's true power wasn't illusion, it was audacity. In an era where authority demanded obedience, his escape mocked the very idea of control. What makes this story unforgettable isn't the trick itself, but what it represented to the common folk. Eustace became a folk hero not because he defied kings, but because he exposed their fragility. His legend grew with every retelling, each tavern adding new flourishes, until the line between man and myth blurred beyond recognition. Was he a sorcerer, a rogue, or just a man who understood that the greatest prison isn't made of stone, but of the assumptions we never think to question? That's the real vanishing act. Long after his death, sailors would swear they glimpsed him on moonlit waves, laughing as the wind carried him beyond the reach of crowns and gallows, a reminder that some men escape history itself by becoming something far more powerful, a story. El Cid's legend didn't end with his death. It burned brighter, fueled by the loyalty of men who refused to let his family fade into captivity. Picture the scene, Valencia's streets, still echoing with the grief of his passing, now bristling with tension as rival lords circled like vultures. His wife Joanna and their daughters, trapped in the very city he'd conquered, faced a grim fate, hostages to a power-hungry noble who saw them as pawns. But the Cid's knights weren't about to let their commander's legacy end in chains. What followed wasn't just a rescue, it was a crusade of devotion, proving that the bonds forged in battle could outlast even mortality itself. The plan was as bold as it was desperate. With Valencia's gates heavily guarded, the knights couldn't rely on force alone. Instead, they turned the enemy's arrogance against them. Disguised as merchants or pilgrims, some accounts even suggest they used the chaos of a staged riot. They slipped into the city's heart, their swords hidden beneath cloaks. Timing was everything. They moved at dusk when shadows stretched long and guards grew complacent, their focus dulled by the monotony of siege, but the true masterstroke. Exploiting the rival lord's own vanity, knowing he'd parade Joanna and her daughters publicly to humiliate the Cid's memory, the knights positioned themselves along the route, blending into the crowd until the moment came to strike. What happened next was less a battle than a tempest. Swords flashed, not in reckless fury, but with the precision of men who'd fought side by side for years. They carved a path to the captives, shielding them with their own bodies as they retreated toward the city's less fortified eastern gate, a weakness the Cid himself had once noted in happier times. The irony was poetic. Even in death, his strategic mind guided their escape. As they burst free into the open countryside, the knights didn't just carry Joanna and her daughters to safety. They carried the unbroken spirit of a leader who taught them that no cause was lost if you refused to surrender. This rescue wasn't just about saving lives, it was about defiance. In an era where widows and orphans were often left to the mercy of conquerors, the Cid's men sent a message that loyalty didn't expire with a heartbeat. Their daring raid echoed across Iberia, immortalized in ballads that turned a military maneuver into a parable of honor. Because here's the truth legends sometimes forget: the Cid's greatest victory wasn't conquering Valencia. It was inspiring men to risk everything for his family when he no longer could. And that's why this story endures not as a footnote, but as a torch. It reminds us that the measure of a leader isn't just the battles they win, but the hearts they ignite long after the final trumpet falls silent. Matilda of Tuscany didn't just command armies, she outmaneuvered them with a kind of cunning that left even seasoned generals speechless. When her castle at Canossa found itself surrounded by hostile forces, the Countess faced a choice: surrender or rewrite the rules of escape. What she chose next wasn't just a tactical retreat, it was a masterstroke of medieval deception that blurred the lines between warrior and shadow. The siege should have been her undoing. Enemy soldiers, confident in their numbers, had sealed every gate and patrol led every road, but Matilda saw what they overlooked: their own assumptions. To them, a noblewoman of her stature would never stoop to disguise, let alone risk the humiliation of crawling through dirt and darkness. That's exactly why it worked. Shedding her silks for the rough wool of a Benedictine monk's robe, she transformed into the one figure no one would question: a humble cleric, head bowed, hands tucked into sleeves, moving with the quiet purpose of a man on holy business. The disguise wasn't just about hiding her face, it weaponized invisibility. In an era where monks moved freely between camps to tend the wounded or deliver last rites, her robes became a passport through enemy line. But the real brilliance lay in her timing. Matilda didn't flee under cover of darkness. She walked out at midday when guards were drowsy from the sun and distracted by the monotony of siege. Legends say she even paused to bless a few soldiers, her Latin flawless, her performance so convincing that years later, those same men would swear no woman could have passed among them unnoticed. By the time her absence was discovered, she was already miles away, rallying fresh troops from her network of loyal vassals. The siege collapsed soon after, not by force of arms, but by the psychological blow of her vanishing act. This escape wasn't just a personal victory, it shattered expectations. Medieval chroniclers, often reluctant to celebrate women's martial prowess, couldn't ignore the sheer audacity of her ruse. Her story spread, emboldening other noblewomen to take active roles in warfare, from commanding defenses to negotiating treaties. And that's the deeper lesson here. Matilda's greatest weapon wasn't her sword or her castle walls. It was her understanding that power often lies in letting your enemies underestimate you, then proving how dearly that mistake will cost them. What makes her legend endure isn't just the daring of her escape, but what it represented. In a world that tried to confine women to towers and tapestries, Matilda of Tuscany refused to be penned in. She didn't just slip through enemy lines, she tore a hole in the fabric of medieval convention, leaving behind a legacy that whispered to generations, authority isn't given. It's taken, sometimes one monk's robe at a time. The Green Knight's challenge wasn't just a test of strength, it was a gauntlet thrown at the very soul of knighthood. When that colossal figure strode into King Arthur's hall, his emerald axe glinting like frozen malice, he offered a game, one strike now, and the same returned in a year and a day. Most men would have trembled. Sir Gawain didn't hesitate, but what unfolded next wasn't merely a duel, it was a rescue mission for something far more fragile than life, the honor of Camelot itself. Gawain's journey to the Green Chapel a year later reads like a slow unraveling of certainty. The icy forests, the howling winds, every step carrying him closer to what seemed like certain death, yet he never wavered. Why? Because this wasn't just about survival. It was about proving that a knight's word could outlast even fear. When he finally stood before the Green Knight again, axe raised high, Gawain's true adversary wasn't the blade about to fall, it was the temptation to flinch, to beg for mercy, to let his vow crumble under the weight of self-preservation. The twist, of course, is that the Green Knight's strike stops just short, a theatrical flourish revealing the entire ordeal as an elaborate test. But here's what makes this more than just a clever plot. Gawain didn't know that. In that heart-stopping moment before the axe fell, he believed he was about to die, and still he held fast. That's the real rescue at the heart of this legend, not of a person but of an ideal. While other medieval tales celebrate physical escapes, Gawain's story salvages something rarer, the unbroken spirit of a man who chooses integrity over instinct. What lingers after the final blow isn't relief but revelation. The Green Knight's game exposed a profound truth, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the will to face it without compromise. And that's why this ballad endures. It's not about the knight who escaped death, but the one who walked willingly toward it, proving that some vows are stronger than steel. In a world where chivalry often crumbled under politics and pride, Gawain's stand became a beacon, a reminder that true honor isn't sworn in feasts and fanfare, but in the quiet moments when no one's watching but your own conscience. Gilles de Rais rode the razor's edge between hero and monster, a man whose early daring made his later crimes all the more unthinkable. Long before the whispers of dark rituals and vanished children, he was Joan of Arc's battle-hardened comrade, a marshal of France who'd stood unflinching against English armies. But even heroes find themselves cornered sometimes. Captured during a skirmish near the Loire, Gilles faced the grim prospect of ransom negotiations or worse, a quiet disappearance into some enemy dungeon. What happened next wasn't just an escape, it was a masterclass in turning desperation into legend. The rope was his salvation, not smuggled in by allies or fashioned from torn linens, but hidden in plain sight, woven into the very fabric of his attire. Some accounts claim it was coiled tightly within his cloak's hem, others that it dangled unseen beneath his surcoat, disguised as decorative cord. Whatever the method, the brilliance lay in its simplicity. While his captors searched for concealed blades or lockpicks, they overlooked the most mundane of tools, and when the moment came, perhaps when guards dozed after a late watch, or when the shuffle of changing shifts created just enough noise, Gilles acted. Knots tied in darkness, a window ledge gripped with bloodied fingers, then the heart-stopping descent into the freedom of night. But this escape carries a chilling footnote. Unlike other medieval fugitives who fled toward redemption, Gilles' story spiraled downward into infamy. That same cunning that engineered his prison break would later twist into something monstrous, his strategic mind warped by obsession and hubris. It's this duality that makes his tale so unsettling, proof that the skills of a hero and a villain often spring from the same source. The rope that saved him as a young knight becomes a grim symbol in hindsight, a thread connecting his two lives, one bathed in battlefield glory, the other shrouded in nightmare. What lingers isn't just the thrill of the getaway, but the uncomfortable questions it raises. How does a man who once scaled castle walls to evade death later become the monster lurking within them? Medieval chroniclers, eager to paint clear moral lines, struggled with Gill's legacy. Some scrubbed his heroism from records, others amplified his crimes as divine punishment for past arrogance. But the truth is far more complex and far more human. His escape reminds us that courage and cruelty can coexist in the same heart, that the line between legend and horror isn't always a wall, but a fraying rope in the dark. And perhaps that's why this story endures, not as inspiration but as warning. Even the boldest escape can't outrun the shadows we carry within. The siege of Antioch tested the limits of human endurance, not just in battle, but in the gnawing emptiness of starvation. For months, the Crusaders had held the city against impossible odds, their supplies dwindling to nothing, leather straps boiled for broth, horses slaughtered down to the last foal, even whispers of men gnawing on charred wood to quiet their stomachs. Then came the rumor a relief force was near, but Turkish patrols blocked the mountain passes. What happened next wasn't just a mission, it was a miracle of medieval grit where a handful of knights defied death to keep hope alive. The plan was madness wrapped in desperation. 12 men, some sources say fewer, volunteered to run the gauntlet, not with swords drawn, but with sacks of grain strapped to their backs, their armor swapped for ragged cloaks to blend into the rocky terrain. Their leader, a lesser-known knight named Reynard, had scouted the enemy lines during night raids. He knew where the sentries dozed, where the narrowest goat paths cut through the cliffs. But knowledge alone couldn't carry food for hundreds. Their real weapon, the arrogance of their foes, the Turks, confident the Crusaders were too weak to attempt escape, had grown lax. Reynard's band moved like shadows, crawling through dried riverbeds and hugging the sheer faces of ravines where no horseman could follow. Disaster struck at dawn. A Turkish scout spotted them near the final ridge, his shout echoing across the valley. What followed was less a battle than a breathless chase, knights weighed down by precious grain, stumbling toward the distant Crusader outposts as arrows hissed past. 2 fell, their bodies left where they lay so others could keep running. Then, just as the Turks closed in, the impossible, a horn blast from the walls. The starving defenders, seeing the distant commotion, mustered their last strength for a diversionary attack. The surviving rescuers collapsed inside the gates, their sacks split open to reveal not just barley and oats, but the unshakable truth that they hadn't been forgotten. This rescue didn't just fill bellies, it reignited a cause. Within days, the full relief force broke through and Antioch held. But the legend of those 12 knights outlived the siege itself. Chroniclers embellished their deeds, angels guiding their steps, their footprints glowing where they passed, but the raw facts needed no embellishment. In an age where survival often meant abandoning the weak, these men chose to crawl back into hell carrying bread. That's why this story echoes through Crusader lore. Not as a tale of swords and glory, but as a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing a knight can do isn't to die for a cause, but to endure for it one staggering step at a time. Frederick II wasn't just any emperor, he was a man who spoke 6 languages, debated philosophy with Arab scholars, and kept a pet menagerie that included camels and a giraffe. So when he found himself trapped in a city that had turned against him, he didn't call for reinforcements or barricade himself in a tower. He did something far more audacious. he vanished into the streets like a ghost, proving that even the most powerful ruler could become invisible with the right disguise. The situation was dire. Frederick had ridden into the rebellious town of Parma expecting submission, only to find its gates slammed shut behind him, its citizens arming for a fight. Most monarchs would have seen this as a moment for siege engines or threats, but Frederick saw opportunity. Shedding his imperial robes for the rough, spun tunic of a merchant, he smudged dirt on his face to mimic the weary look of a man who'd traveled too long under the sun. The genius wasn't just in the costume, it was in the details. He slouched slightly, softening the proud posture drilled into him since childhood. He let his famed red beard go uncombed, hiding its distinctive hue beneath a hood. And when he spoke, it wasn't in the refined Latin of courts, but the clipped dialect of a trader from the south. Timing was everything. He waited for the chaos of market day, when the streets teemed with farmers hawking produce and pilgrims begging alms. Then, with a sack of onions slung over his shoulder, both prop and weapon, should he need to brawl, he simply walked out. Guards scanning the crowd for a crowned head never glanced twice at another grubby traveler. By nightfall, Frederick was miles away, laughing with his generals as they plotted their return. But the real victory wasn't the escape itself, it was the lesson it taught. In an era where kings were expected to lead from the front, clad in gleaming armor, Frederick's stunt revealed a deeper truth. True power isn't about being seen. It's about knowing when to disappear. Chroniclers of the time spun wild tales to explain his getaway secret tunnels, bribed guards, even black magic. But the simplest explanation was the most revolutionary. A ruler's greatest weapon wasn't his sword or his crown. It was his ability to step out of his own legend, if only for an afternoon, and walk unnoticed among his people. What makes this escape unforgettable isn't just the cleverness, it's the irony. Frederick spent his reign building castles stamped with his emblem, commissioning portraits to immortalize his image. Yet his legacy includes this moment where he erased himself completely, proving that sometimes the mightiest throne is the one you willingly step down from. And that's why this story endures, not as a tale of a king in hiding, but as a reminder that real authority doesn't come from being feared. It comes from being unpredictable. Tristan's climb up the tower wasn't just about reaching Isolde. It was a dance with fate, where every handhold could mean discovery, and every whispered word could unravel a kingdom. Picture the scene, moonlight slicing through the bars of Isolde's prison, her silhouette framed high above the crashing waves of the Irish coast. Below, armed sentries paced, their torches cutting arcs through the darkness. To them, the sheer stone walls were unclimbable. To Tristan, they were a ladder carved by desperation and love. What makes this rescue legendary isn't just the physical risk, it's the layers of deception woven into every moment. Disguise alone wouldn't suffice. The guards knew every face in the castle. Instead, Tristan turned the night itself into his ally. Timing his ascent with the changing of the watch, he moved when the guards' attention flickered, when their gazes drifted toward the warmth of the braziers or the distant call of an owl. His hands, calloused from years of swordplay, found cracks in the mortar invisible to anyone not willing to press their body flush against the cold stone. And then there was the harp. Some versions of the tale claim he carried it slung across his back, its strings muffled against his cloak, not as a weapon but as a key. Isolde's tower wasn't just guarded by men, it was locked by her uncle's paranoia. But who would suspect a minstrel scaling walls in the dead of night? The reunion itself was a masterpiece of silent communication. No dramatic cries, no clashing steel. Just fingers brushing through the bars as Tristan passed Isolde the tools of her own escape. A rope woven from bedsheets, a dagger small enough to hide in a sleeve. Some say she lowered herself to him. Others insist he carried her down the cliff face, her arms tight around his neck as the surf roared beneath them. But the most haunting detail, the guards never raised an alarm. Whether from Tristan's skill or Isolde's foresight, perhaps she'd slipped something into their evening ale, the pair vanished like mist dissolving in dawn's first light. This escape resonates because it twists the classic rescue trope into something deeper. Tristan wasn't just saving Isolde from a tower, he was freeing her from a political marriage, from a life traded like coin between kingdoms. Their flight wasn't merely reckless, it was a rebellion against the very idea that love could be chained by treaties or thrones, and that's why their story outlived the medieval courts that first whispered it. It's not about the height of the tower or the sharpness of the guards' swords. It's about the quiet understanding between two people that some risks aren't just worth taking. They're the only choices that leave the soul intact. Centuries later, we still retell their tale not because it ends happily, but because it dares us to ask, what walls would we climb for the chance to be free? The answer isn't in the legends. It's in the heartbeat that quickens when we hear Tristan's name, the part of us that still believes, against all odds, in love's power to defy even gravity. Bertrand du Guesclin's captivity should have been the end of his story, a French war hero rotting in an English dungeon, his battles reduced to memories. But Bertrand understood something his captors didn't. Chains can't hold a man who's won the hearts of his jailers. Where others saw guards, he saw an audience. Where enemies saw a prisoner, he saw opportunity. And so began one of history's most audacious vanishing acts, not with a clenched fist, but with an open hand and a disarming smile. The English had every reason to be wary. This was the man who'd outmaneuvered them at Pontverlaine, the scarred Breton brawler whose name made seasoned knights hesitate. Yet within weeks of his capture, something peculiar happened. Bertrand became a fixture in the castle's daily life, sharing wineskins with sentries, regaling cooks with tales of Moorish battles, even teaching the warden's son how to wield a practice sword. His genius, he never asked for favors, he simply made himself indispensable. When the castle's well pulley snapped, it was Bertrand who rigged a replacement from torn saddle straps. When dysentery swept through the garrison, he shared remedies learned from Spanish physicians. Piece by piece, he turned his prison into a stage where he wasn't the captive, but the star. Then came the masterstroke. On a fog-drenched morning when the castle buzzed with preparations for a hunting expedition, Bertrand didn't sneak out, he strolled. Dressed in a borrowed cloak, humming a tune he'd learned from the stable boys, he passed through the gates with a casual wave to the same guards who'd once barred his way. No dramatic chase, no clashing steel, just a man walking into the mist as naturally as if he'd been summoned home for supper. By the time his absence was noted, he was already deep in the Breton countryside, sheltered by farmers who'd sooner hide him than betray him to the English crown. What makes this escape extraordinary isn't the method, but the psychology behind it. Bertrand didn't just escape a prison, he dismantled it from the inside by reshaping how his captors saw him. Medieval warfare was built on strict hierarchies, lord and servant, victor and vanquished. But du Guesclin blurred those lines until his jailers forgot he was supposed to be their enemy. In that way, his story isn't just about escape, it's about the power of charisma to rewrite the rules of captivity. Long after his death, French mothers would tell their children that the greatest fortress Bertrand ever conquered wasn't a castle wall, but the space between suspicion and trust. And that's why his legend endures. Not as a tale of brute force, but as a reminder that sometimes the strongest chains are the ones we convince others to unshackle themselves. The bridge should have been a death sentence, a narrow stone arch spanning a rushing river, its far side swarming with enemy soldiers. but to Pierre Terrel, the Chevalier Bayard, it was just another stage for the kind of heroics that would etch his name into legend. That day, as his wounded comrade lay trapped on the opposite bank, outnumbered and outmatched, Bayard didn't call for reinforcements. He didn't hesitate. With a sword in one hand and an unshakable sense of honor in the other, he planted himself at the bridge's center and dared the world to try passing him. What unfolded next wasn't just a skirmish, it was a masterclass in medieval psychology. Bayard knew the real battle wasn't against blades, but against fear. His enemies, though numerous, had to approach him single file on that cramped span. Each attacker faced him alone, their numerical advantage rendered useless by the bottleneck. And with every parry and counterstrike, Bayard didn't just defend the bridge, he weaponized his reputation. By then, stories of his near-mythical skill had spread through enemy ranks. The longer he held, the more hesitation crept into their charges. Men who'd laughed at the idea of one knight stopping an army now wondered if they'd stumbled into something supernatural. The details vary by chronicler, but the core truth remains. Bayard fought not like a man desperate to survive, but like someone who'd already decided how the story would end. Some accounts claim he disarmed opponents with precise strikes to their wrists, leaving them humiliated but alive. Others say he taunted them between clashes, offering to teach them proper swordsmanship if they surrendered. The most vivid versions describe him using the bridge's railings as leverage, kicking loose stones into the river to unsettle attackers mid-step. Whatever the tactics, the result was the same, a slow, grinding retreat as the enemy's morale cracked under the weight of his defiance. But here's what makes this stand more than just a feat of arms. Bayard didn't hold the bridge to win glory or land. He did it to buy time, precious minutes for his wounded friend to drag himself to safety behind their lines. In an era where knights were often glorified mercenaries, his actions redefined what it meant to be chivalrous. The real rescue wasn't the comrade's escape. It was the moment Bayard proved that true courage isn't about defeating foes, but about giving others the chance to live. Long after his death, soldiers would recount this battle not for its violence, but for its purity. No banners, no ransom, just one man and a bridge, and the unspoken belief that some things are worth standing for, even if you stand alone. That's why Bayard's legend endures when so many others fade. In a world full of kings who waged wars for gold and titles, he became something rarer, a reminder that heroism isn't measured by what you take, but by what you're willing to hold onto when everything else slips away. The bridge still stands today, though the river's course has shifted, but walk its stones now and you'll feel it, not the echo of clashing steel, but the quiet certainty that some men don't need armies to change history. Sometimes all they need is enough ground to plant their feet and the courage to say, no further. Joanna of Flanders didn't wait for rescue, she became the storm. When enemy forces surrounded her castle at Hennebont, cutting off supplies and mocking the idea of a woman commanding its defense, they made one fatal mistake, assuming she'd cower behind stone walls. Instead, Joanna orchestrated an escape so audacious it redefined medieval warfare and carved her name into history as the Flame of Brittany. The siege had dragged on for weeks, with enemy commanders growing complacent. They'd grown accustomed to the rhythms of medieval warfare, the predictable parleys, the occasional arrow volley, the slow grind of starvation tactics. Joanna saw their complacency as her weapon. One sweltering afternoon, as the besiegers lazed in the summer heat, she ordered the castle's gates flung open. But this wasn't surrender, it was a trap dressed as desperation. Leading the charge herself, armored in a padded gambeson with her hair braided tightly beneath a steel cap, Joanna burst forth at the head of 300 retainers. The sight alone was enough to stun the enemy, a noblewoman, sword in hand, screaming a war cry that echoed across the fields. Chaos erupted. The besiegers, caught off guard and scattered across their camp, couldn't form ranks fast enough. Joanna's forces didn't just break through, they burned everything in their path. Tents became bonfires, supply wagons were hacked apart, and the enemy's siege engines, so painstakingly constructed, were reduced to smoldering wreckage. But the true masterstroke came next. Instead of fleeing to safety, Joanna wheeled her company around and struck again, this time from the rear. The psychological blow was devastating. Grown men, seasoned knights, reportedly fled at the rumor of her approach, whispering that she must be possessed. What makes this escape legendary isn't just the tactical brilliance, it's the cultural earthquake it caused. Medieval chroniclers, uncomfortable with the idea of women in combat, often downplayed female warriors as anomalies or miracles, but Joanna refused to fit their mold. She didn't just escape a siege, she shattered expectations, proving that leadership and courage weren't bound by gender. Years later, when her husband was captured in battle, she'd do it again, raising an army, blockading ports, and negotiating his release like a seasoned warlord. The flame of Brittany's legacy burns bright because it wasn't just about one daring breakout. It was about the moment the medieval world was forced to confront an inconvenient truth, that the fiercest flames aren't always the ones you see coming. Sometimes they're the ones you underestimate until it's too late. The tale begins not with a battle or a siege, but with silence, the terrible, unnatural quiet of a castle where children's laughter once echoed. A jealous stepmother's curse had turned 6 brothers and their sister into swans, their human voices stolen, their identities hidden beneath feathers. But magic, even at its cruelest, often overlooks one thing: the stubbornness of love. The youngest sister, spared the full force of the enchantment, clung to her humanity with a single purpose: to break the spell, no matter the cost. Her quest wasn't armed with swords or subterfuge, but with something far more relentless: patience. For 6 years, she wove shirts from nettles, her fingers bleeding as she gathered the stinging plants in moonlit fields. By day, she hid in forests, silent as the swans she sought to save, because speaking even a single word would unravel her work. Medieval audiences would have understood the deeper allegory here, that true rescue often demands not grand gestures but quiet endurance. The nettles represented more than a magical remedy. They were the sharp, unglamorous reality of sacrifice, each prick a reminder that love isn't measured in moments of glory, but in the ache of persistence. The climax of the tale hinges on a heart-wrenching choice. When the sister finally completes 5 shirts, she discovers she's run out of time. Her brothers are to be executed at dawn. In her rush to save them, she throws the shirts over the swans, transforming them back into humans. But the youngest brother is left with one arm still a wing, his shirt unfinished. This detail, often glossed over in retellings, carries profound weight. It acknowledges that some wounds never fully heal, that rescue doesn't always mean perfection. The siblings' reunion isn't a fairy tale ending. It's bittersweet, shadowed by the cost of what couldn't be undone. What makes this legend endure isn't just its magic, but its raw honesty about family. The sister's rescue succeeds not because she's a warrior or a sorceress, but because she refuses to let go. In a medieval world where kinship ties were as much about politics as affection, the story whispered a dangerous truth: that loyalty could defy even the most powerful curses. And the Swan children, once restored, don't seek vengeance or wealth. They simply disappear into the forest, a quiet testament that some bonds are stronger than the spells that try to break them. Centuries later, the tale still resonates because it understands something primal: that the most powerful enchantments aren't cast by witches, but by love itself. The sister's silence, her bleeding hands, her imperfect salvation, they're not just plot points. They're a mirror held up to anyone who's ever fought for family against impossible odds. And that's why we keep telling it, not for the magic of the swans, but for the miracle of the hands that refused to stop weaving, even when hope seemed as fleeting as a bird on the wind. Charles the Bold didn't just escape captivity, he turned his prison into a theater and his weakness into a weapon. The Duke of Burgundy, a man whose very name evoked power and ruthlessness, found himself in a nightmare scenario, locked away by a rival lord after a disastrous battle, his fate hanging on the whims of men who'd pay a fortune to see him humbled. But Charles understood something his captors forgot: the most dangerous prisoner isn't the one who rages against the bars, but the one who convinces you he's already broken. The act began with a cough, then another. Soon the Duke was slumped in his cell, his breathing ragged, his face slick with feverish sweat. Guards who'd been warned of his temper watched with growing unease as the mighty warrior deteriorated before their eyes. Medieval medicine being what it was, illness was a spectre feared more than any sword, and Charles played the part to perfection. He refused meals, let his beard grow matted, even mimicked the glassy-eyed stare of a man slipping toward death. When a physician was finally summoned, the diagnosis was grim: a pestilence, possibly contagious. Panic spread through the garrison. No one wanted to die for a prisoner, especially not one whose ransom might now never be paid. That's when the guards made their fatal mistake. Deciding the Duke was too weak to require chains, they left him untethered just long enough for Charles to strike. The moment the chamber door clicked shut behind the retreating physician, the dying man moved with the precision of a coiled spring. Accounts differ on the details. Some say he strangled a guard with the man's own belt, others that he smashed a ewer over a sentry's head, but the outcome was the same. Within minutes, Charles stood in stolen armor, barking orders in a voice suddenly strong enough to shake the rafters. By the time the alarm was raised, he was already a mile downstream on a stolen horse. His illness vanished like morning mist. What makes this escape more than just a cunning ruse is what it reveals about the psychology of medieval power. Charles didn't just exploit his captors' fear of disease, he weaponized their assumptions about nobility. To them, a duke was too proud, too conscious of his dignity, to debase himself with such a performance. That arrogance blinded them to the truth. For a man like Charles, survival wasn't about dignity. It was about adaptability. In an era where royal captives were usually treated with deference, his willingness to play the beggar, to grovel, to wheeze, to let himself be pitied was the ultimate act of rebellion against the rules of the game. The aftermath rippled across Europe. Charles' enemies spun tales of dark magic or bribed guards, unable to admit they'd been outwitted by a man who'd faked his own decline. His allies, meanwhile, saw the escape as divine favor, proof that Burgundy's destiny couldn't be contained by mortal chains. But the real lesson was subtler. Charles' gambit exposed the fragility of the systems that bound medieval society, the unspoken truth that even the mightiest lords were just one convincing performance away from losing everything. And that's why his story endures, not as a tale of strength, but as a masterclass in the art of making your enemies underestimate you, then leaving them to wonder, as they nursed their shame, whether the sickness had ever been fake at all. The White Company didn't just fight for gold, they bled for loyalty. When their employer, the cunning condottiero John Hawkwood, rode straight into an ambush near the Tuscan hills, his enemies thought they'd cornered a fox. What they didn't count on was the pack that would turn on them. Outnumbered 3-1, the mercenaries could have cut their losses and fled. Instead, they formed a bristling ring of steel around Hawkwood, their swords glinting like teeth in the fading light. This wasn't just a battle, it was a brotherhood's last stand, where every parry whispered an unspoken vow. No one gets left behind. What made these mercenaries different? Discipline disguised as chaos. Most hired swords fought in loose, opportunistic bands, scattering when the tide turned. But the White Company drilled like monks of war, their movements synchronized through years of campaigning together. As the enemy closed in, they didn't just hold ground, they rotated. A living fortress where tired fighters swapped places seamlessly with fresh ones, their formation breathing like a single organism. Chroniclers would later call it a dance of death, but to the men in the circle it was pure instinct. Hawkwood, wounded but grinning, fought alongside them, his falchion rising and falling in rhythm with his men's. There was no hierarchy in that moment, just a shared pulse, a recognition that survival depended on the man at your back. The legends focus on the bloodshed, the way the company's poleaxes hooked riders from saddles, how their crossbowmen picked off enemy commanders with chilling precision. But the real miracle was their retreat. As dusk thickened, the mercenaries didn't break for the tree line in a desperate scramble. They walked backward, step by disciplined step, dragging their wounded with them until the forest swallowed them whole. By dawn, they'd vanished into the Apennines, leaving behind a field littered with the corpses of would-be ambushers, and a lesson that echoed across Italy. The White Company's true weapon wasn't their blades, but the unshakable trust between them. This rescue resonates because it defies the mercenary stereotype. These weren't just sellswords, they were a family forged in battle, their loyalty measured in the inches of ground they refused to yield. Hawkwood himself, a man who'd built his career on cold calculation, would later refuse to campaign against former company members, citing debts no ledger could record. That's the heart of their legend, not the battles won, but the bonds that made victory possible. In an age where contracts were signed in blood and broken with a wink, the White Company stood as living proof that even in war's darkest corners, honor could still hold fast. Their story endures not because of the gold they earned, but because of the far rarer currency they traded in, the unbreakable certainty that when death comes, you won't face it alone. Elena of Aquitaine's prison had no bars, only the weight of a crown, and the watchful eyes of guards who thought they'd finally tamed the most formidable woman in Europe. Confined to the tower of Salisbury Castle by her own husband, Henry II, Elena faced a sentence worse than chains: silence. Cut off from allies, forbidden from seeing her sons, she was meant to fade into history as a cautionary tale for rebellious queens. But Elena had spent a lifetime mastering the art of turning weakness into power, and her intellect would soon carve a path through stone itself. The hidden tunnels beneath Salisbury weren't just architectural quirks, they were Elena's lifeline. Medieval castles often had secret passages for servants or escape, but Elena transformed hers into something far more dangerous: an information network. Through coded messages slipped to sympathetic maids or tucked into empty wine casks, she maintained contact with supporters across England and her native Aquitaine. Some legends claim she even received books of philosophy, law, poetry smuggled through the passages to keep her mind sharp. The genius wasn't just in the method, but the misdirection. While Henry's spies watched for overt rebellions, Elena waged war with whispers, using the very isolation meant to break her as cover for her schemes. Her greatest coup came not with swords but with patience. Over 15 years of captivity, Elena cultivated loyalty in unlikely places: a disgruntled steward, a homesick guard from Aquitaine, even a visiting troubadour who carried her verses to her sons like encrypted battle plans. By the time Henry died and their son Richard the Lionheart took the throne, Elena didn't need to storm the gates. She walked out freely, her release negotiated by allies she'd nurtured through years of clandestine letters. The tunnels had served their purpose, but the real passage to freedom had been dug with words, not pickaxes. What makes Elena's escape extraordinary isn't the drama, it's the longevity. While others broke free in moments of chaos, she engineered her liberation over decades, proving that the sharpest weapon in a prisoner's arsenal isn't strength but stamina. Her story reshaped medieval politics, teaching rulers a hard lesson. You can lock a queen in a tower, but you can't cage her influence. Long after her death, the tunnels at Salisbury became a metaphor for the unseen power of the marginalized, proof that even when the world tries to bury you alive, you can still dig your way toward daylight, one secret at a time. The dragon's breath scorched the earth, its sulphurous stench choking the air as the princess stood frozen, not with fear but with resignation. This was how her story would end, not in a palace but in the shadow of monstrous jaws. Then came the thunder of hooves, the glint of silver armor, and a single cry that split the sky like lightning. In the name of Christ, St. George's charge wasn't just a battle. It was a collision of worlds where faith and steel met scales and hellfire. What makes this myth endure isn't the dragon's death, but the moment before the strike. Medieval audiences knew the real rescue wasn't the princess's survival. It was her transformation from sacrificial lamb to witness. In earlier versions of the tale, she doesn't cower behind George. She holds the leash that binds the beast, her hands steady as the knight's lance finds its mark. That detail, often glossed over, reveals the story's beating heart. True heroism doesn't erase the victim's agency, it amplifies it. George doesn't just save the princess, he sees her, turning her from a nameless offering into a co-conspirator against darkness. The legend's power lies in its layers. On one level, it's pure spectacle, a celestial warrior vanquishing chaos. But dig deeper, and it becomes a medieval manifesto on divine justice. The dragon isn't just a monster, it's famine, plague, the ever-present shadow of a merciless world. George's victory, clad in the trappings of sanctity, told peasants and kings alike that evil wasn't invincible, that even the mightiest horrors could fall before courage consecrated by faith. No wonder crusaders painted his cross on their shields. His story was the ultimate metaphor for their holy war. Yet the most revolutionary twist lies in what happened after the battle. Unlike other dragon slayers who claimed gold or glory, George famously refused reward. His rescue wasn't transactional, it was sacramental. That refusal resonated in an era where knights were often little more than mercenaries with titles. By making his act selfless, the legend elevated rescue from mere physical survival to a spiritual ideal. Monasteries began using George's tale to teach that true nobility wasn't in bloodline, but in the willingness to stand between the vulnerable and the abyss. Centuries later, the echoes of this myth still shape our stories, from shining knights to superheroes, but its deepest legacy is subtler. In a world that often reduces rescue to brute force, St. George and the princess remind us that the greatest victories happen when savior and saved fight side by side. The dragon dies not just by the lance, but by the unbroken chain of their shared defiance. And that's why this story outlived the Middle Ages. Not because it tells us monsters can be slain, but because it whispers something far more dangerous, that no one is ever truly alone in the dark. Robert the Bruce didn't just flee into the night, he dissolved into it, leaving behind only the whisper of trampled bracken and the growing fury of his pursuers. The English hounds bayed in the distance, their handlers' torches cutting jagged wounds through the Highland mist, but the Scottish king was already becoming something more than a man. To his enemies, he was a phantom. To his people, he was the living embodiment of a land that refused to be conquered. And in that moment of desperate flight, Bruce proved that survival could be its own kind of rebellion. The English had every reason to believe the hunt was over. After the disaster at Methven, Bruce's forces were shattered, his family captured or scattered. Most kings would have surrendered or died on their knees, but Bruce had spent years studying guerrilla warfare in the bogs and glens, not as a nobleman but as an outlaw. He knew the moors could swallow an army whole if you moved like the land itself. Shedding his royal surcoat for a shepherd's rough plaid, he vanished into the heather, his small band of loyalists splitting into ever smaller groups to scatter the scent. Some legends claim he slept in hollow trees, others that he waded miles upstream to throw off tracking dogs. The truth was simpler. Bruce understood that terrain was more than geography, it was a weapon. What happened next wasn't just evasion, it was psychological warfare. With each failed ambush, each empty cave the English stormed, Bruce's legend grew. Peasants who'd never seen him swore they had, spinning tales of a king who could walk through rain without leaving footprints. His enemies, frustrated by shadows, began seeing him everywhere, a figure glimpsed on a distant ridge, a voice carried on the wind. The genius of Bruce's escapes lay in their ambiguity. By never staying long enough to be truly seen, he became infinite, a spectre haunting the English imagination. Even his famous encounter with the spider in the cave, if it happened at all, was less about inspiration and more about perception. A king who could draw courage from something as fragile as a web was a king who understood that resilience wasn't about strength, but adaptability. The climax came at Loch Truel, cornered on a narrow pass with English archers above him. Bruce didn't retreat, he turned the landscape into a death trap for his pursuers. As armored knights stumbled over rain-slicked rocks, his Highlanders rolled boulders down the slopes, transforming geography into artillery. It was here that the hunted became the hunter, proving that every escape Bruce had made wasn't just about saving his own skin. It was about choosing the ground on which he'd finally stand and fight. That's why these escapes outshone even his victories. In an age when kings were expected to lead glittering charges, Bruce redefined leadership as the art of vanishing when necessary, only to reappear where he'd be least expected. His greatest legacy wasn't Bannockburn's triumph, but the months before it, when he proved that sometimes the bravest thing a leader can do is disappear long enough to let his enemies' arrogance become their undoing. The lesson echoed far beyond Scotland. True freedom isn't just won on battlefields. It's forged in the dark spaces between pursuit and persistence, where a single man's refusal to be caught can become the spark that lights a nation's defiance. The last ships strained against their moorings, their decks crammed with women clutching children, merchants gripping their last scraps of wealth, wounded soldiers slumped against the rails, all fleeing the inferno that had been Acre. Behind them, the city burned in great, guttering tongues of flame, its walls crumbling under the hammer blows of Mamluk siege engines, and between the doomed city and the sea stood the final, unbroken line, 200 Knights Templar, their white mantles streaked with soot and blood, buying time with their lives. This wasn't just a last stand, it was a rescue rewritten in fire and sacrifice. The Templars knew the numbers. Against the Sultan's thousands, they couldn't hold. But they didn't need to hold forever, just long enough for the last galley to clear the harbor. Their Grand Master, Guillaume de Beaujeu, had already fallen, an arrow through his lung, but his order fought on without command. They anchored their line at the city's bottleneck gates, where the Mamluks' numerical advantage meant nothing. One by one, they fell, not in reckless charges, but in methodical retreat, ceding ground inch by precious inch to stretch each minute into eternity for those scrambling onto the ships. What makes their sacrifice extraordinary isn't the brutality, it's the calculus behind it. These weren't wide-eyed zealots seeking martyrdom. They were hardened warriors who'd spent decades mastering the logistics of war. Every second they wrested from the enemy was measured in lives saved. a mother making it up the gangplank, a child hauled aboard by sailors, a wounded comrade dragged to safety. Chroniclers later wrote of their cold fury, a discipline so absolute it unnerved even the Mamluks. When their swords shattered, they fought with daggers. When their daggers broke, they used stones, and when the last Templar fell, the harbor was empty. The aftermath was silence, no ballads, no relics, no triumphant returns. Just the sea swallowing the smoke of Acre's pyre. Yet their legacy rippled far beyond that bloody shore. In an era when chivalry often meant glory-seeking tournaments, the Templars' final act redefined knightly virtue as something far more radical, the willingness to become the bridge others cross to safety, even if it burns beneath you. Their story spread through refugee ships and whispered confessionals, morphing into legend not because it was miraculous, but because it was so devastatingly human. These men, flawed and fierce like all soldiers, chose to plant their boots in the ashes of a lost cause and say, "No further." That's why this moment outlasts the Crusades themselves. It asks a question that echoes through every age. What does it mean to rescue when victory is impossible? The Templars answered not with theology, but with their bodies. Their rescue wasn't measured in territory held or enemies slain, but in the faces of those who'd never know their names. The ones who lived because 200 men decided dying slowly was worth more than fleeing fast. And perhaps that's the truest rescue of all. Not the grand gestures history remembers, but the quiet ones that let history keep being written. Reynard the Fox didn't just escape trouble, he danced through it, leaving his enemies tangled in their own rage and confusion. Though born from medieval fables, this crimson-furred trickster embodied a truth every underdog knew. When you're outmatched by strength, you fight with guile. His most infamous stunt, faking his own death, wasn't just a storybook flourish. It was a mirror held up to the real cunning of the medieval world, where survival often hinged on theatrics as much as steel. Picture the scene, Reynard cornered at last, the king's court baying for his blood over a lifetime of misdeeds, stolen geese, duped nobles, entire villages left red-faced in his wake. His execution seems inevitable until he drops to the ground, limbs twitching, tongue lolling, his breath vanishing as if snatched by the devil himself. The crowd gasps, even his accusers hesitate, torn between triumph and superstition. Then, in the heartbeat of uncertainty while they debate burying or burning his corpse, Reynard springs to life and bolts for the trees. It's a masterclass in misdirection, proving that the quickest way out of a noose isn't breaking it, but convincing everyone the rope's already empty. What makes Reynard's antics more than just entertainment is how closely they paralleled real medieval survival strategies. Peasants feigned illness to avoid oppressive taxes. Smugglers draped nets over their boats to mimic seaweed and slip past harbor patrols. Even knights, despite their chivalric posturing, occasionally played dead on battlefields to crawl away under cover of chaos. Reynard's genius was taking these scattered tactics and polishing them into art, showing that deception wasn't just a last resort, it was a craft worthy of study. The deeper brilliance, Reynard's escapes always left his enemies diminished beyond the immediate loss. Every time the wolf Isengrim or the bear Bruin fell for his ruses, their authority eroded a little more. That's why these fables resonated far beyond peasant firesides. For the powerless whether serfs bound to land or minor nobles squeezed by overlords, Reynard's victories were wish fulfillment wrapped in fur. He proved that systems of power, no matter how rigid, always had cracks, and if you were clever enough to spot them, you could wriggle through. But here's the twist medieval audiences understood: Reynard was no hero. His escapes often left collateral damage: innocent chickens, honest tradesmen, even his own family sometimes paid the price. That moral ambiguity made his stories endure. They weren't just about beating the odds, they forced listeners to grapple with an uncomfortable question: how much deception is justified when the deck is stacked against you? The answer shifted depending on who was telling the tale. A lord might paint Reynard as a villain, while a peasant secretly cheered his ingenuity. That duality is why Reynard's legacy slinks through history long after other fables faded. He wasn't just a character, he was an argument, a reminder that in a world where brute force usually won, wit could still carve out moments of triumph. And perhaps that's the real escape at the heart of his stories, not from traps or executioners, but from the idea that the powerless must always play by the rules of the powerful. The fox's greatest trick wasn't faking his death. It was showing that sometimes the best way to survive is to let your enemies think they've already won, while you're halfway to the next adventure. The story of Saint Ginefort begins not with a miracle, but with a terrible misunderstanding, one that turned a loyal greyhound into an unlikely martyr. Picture a medieval nobleman returning home to find his infant son's cradle overturned, the blankets splattered with blood, and his beloved hound standing nearby, jaws still wet. The conclusion seemed obvious. In a rage, the nobleman drew his sword and struck the dog down, only to discover the truth moments later. The child was unharmed, hidden safely beneath the cradle. The blood belonged to a viper the greyhound had slain in defense of his master's heir. By then, it was too late. The nobleman's grief was so profound that he buried the hound with honors, and soon whispers began spreading among the local peasants. What happened next defied all church doctrine. Though never canonized, Ginefort became a folk saint, a four-legged patron of the unjustly accused. Mothers brought sick children to his gravesite in the forests of France, leaving tiny shoes as offerings. Peasants prayed to him for protection against false accusations, their candles flickering between the roots of ancient oaks. The cult of Saint Ginefort wasn't just about a dog. It was a quiet rebellion against a world where the powerless could be destroyed by a single mistaken judgment. In a time when even humans could be condemned on hearsay, the idea that an animal's loyalty might outshine human folly struck a chord. The church, of course, was horrified. By the 13th century, inquisitors were tearing down Ginefort's shrines, calling the veneration blasphemous. But heresy has a way of outlasting authority. The rituals continued in secret, passed down through generations like a hidden counterspell against injustice. That's the true power of this legend. It wasn't just about a wronged pet. It gave medieval commoners something rare, a symbol that their suffering was seen, even if by a ghostly hound rather than heaven's saints. Ginefort's legacy lingers in the unlikeliest places. Modern scholars see his cult as a precursor to animal rights movements, while psychologists recognize it as early evidence of humanity's need to anthropomorphize loyalty. But perhaps the most poignant detail is this: long after the church erased his name from records, farmers still spoke of a greyhound's ghost padding through the woods at dusk, not as a specter of vengeance but as a silent witness. A reminder that some debts can't be repaid, only remembered. And in that memory, even the smallest act of devotion can become a kind of sainthood. Behind every legendary escape lies a grain of truth, often hardened by time into something far grander than reality. Medieval storytellers weren't just entertainers. They were myth makers, reshaping historical near misses into feats of superhuman cunning. Take Richard the Lionheart's getaway from Duenstein. Chroniclers added secret tunnels and minstrel disguises, but the core truth that a king could slip past his captors by exploiting their complacency was radical enough. These embellishments weren't lies, they were cultural pressure valves. In societies where peasants faced starvation for defying lords, the idea that even monarchs could be outwitted offered a dangerous thrill. The line between history and legend often blurred around one recurring theme: the underestimated underdog. Matilda of Tuscany's monk disguise resonated because it flouted the medieval belief that nobility was visible, that God marked the mighty with fine features and rich garb. Her escape whispered a subversive truth: power could wear rags. Similarly, tales of peasants tunneling into castles to rescue loved ones, like the fictional Jack the Giant Killer, likely sprang from real mining tactics in sieges. By elevating these acts to folklore, commoners transformed practical survival skills into moral victories, a proof that ingenuity could topple brute strength. Yet the darkest escapes reveal more about medieval fears than hopes. Gilles de Rais's rope trick takes on chilling irony when we remember his later crimes. His story became a cautionary tale about the dual nature of cunning, how the same skills that saved a knight could later damn him. Likewise, the White Company's battlefield rescues were celebrated, but their mercenary loyalty also unnerved rulers. These weren't just adventures, they were societal flashpoints, revealing anxiety about violence that couldn't be controlled by feudal oaths, the most telling detail. Many legends feature rescuers who vanish afterward, like the Knight of the Swan or Hereward the Wake. In a rigidly stratified world, these ambiguous endings offered solace. Maybe the hero was a noble incognito, or maybe he really was a commoner who'd outplayed the system. That uncertainty was the real escape, not from chains, but from the crushing weight of medieval destiny. The stories endure because they don't just tell us how people fled, they show us what they long to break free from. From cunning disguises to midnight raids, these 26 escapes and rescues prove one undeniable truth: the medieval world thrived on more than brute force. Behind every towering castle wall and iron-barred dungeon lay a battleground of wits, where the sharpest weapon wasn't always a blade, but a well-timed distraction, a smuggled key, or the audacity to walk straight through the front gate disguised as the enemy. These stories endure not because they're tales of survival, but because they're blueprints for rebellion. Each one whispers the same dangerous idea: no cage is unbreakable when the mind inside refuses to be tamed. Consider the contrasts: Richard the Lionheart's royal charm melting guards' vigilance, while Reynard the Fox's theatrical death feints exposed the fragility of power. Matilda of Tuscany's monk robe proved authority could be shrugged off like a cloak, and the White Company's battlefield brotherhood redefined loyalty beyond gold or oaths. These legends didn't just defy physical barriers, they shattered expectations, turning weakness into strategy and desperation into art, the most astonishing detail. Many of these escapes weren't solo acts. From the Templars' sacrificial line at Acre to the sister weaving nettle shirts for her Swan brothers, they reveal how bonds of blood, duty, or sheer stubbornness could outlast even the darkest captivity. So why do these stories still grip us? Perhaps because they're more than history, they're mirrors. In a world where modern castles take the form of systemic injustices or personal struggles, these medieval feats remind us that the human spirit's refusal to surrender isn't bound by era. The next time you face an impossible wall, remember, someone in the Middle Ages probably outsmarted one just like it. Now it's your turn. Which legend left you breathless? Was it Tristan's moonlit climb, Joanna of Flanders' fiery charge, or the quiet martyrdom of Ginefort? Drop your favorite in the comments. We're all students of these escape artists. And if you crave more tales where history's underdogs rewrite the rules, hit subscribe. Until our next adventure, keep one lesson close. Courage might open the door, but wit will keep you